Well, welcome back, folks. Today I thought I'd do a brief little video and give you an update on the work or progress on this 1980 Yamaha XT250 that belongs to someone else. A few videos back I did a little introduction on this bike that I'm repairing for the brother of my neighbor, and his concern was he couldn't get it to start. He went to start it recently and he could get nothing out of it. I think eventually he might have got a couple of pops when he used starting fluid. But other than that, it wouldn't run, and on top of that, it had a major fuel leak, and the brake light didn't work on either the handbrake control at the handlebar or the foot brake, and the horn didn't work. So those are the things he asked me to address. So I've been playing around with it on the side here over the last couple of weeks, and as you can see, I've got a temporary fuel tank set up here. I pulled the original tank off and drained it. And this does have ethanol-free fuel in it. And my intention was to see if I could get it to start or pop at all. So the first thing I did before I even ran fuel to it is I pulled the air cleaner element out. That's what this is right here. And it just slides in from the side, from the right side. And shot a little ether in there, starting fluid, and it started right up, and it ran, for a few seconds and then died out, of course. I did that a couple of times. Didn't want to overdo it, but I did do it a few times, and it would start. So I thought, that's most curious. Rigged up my temporary fuel tank. You probably have seen this before in previous videos. As you can see, it's still in position from when I set it up previous. Ran it to the inlet on the carburetor. I did pad underneath the carburetor with a pile of shop towels, fabric shop towels, in case there was a fuel leak, because that was one of his concerns, that it seemed to be leaking fuel. And in case it did leak fuel, I didn't want it going all over the floor in the shop. Turned the fuel valve on very slowly and carefully and watched. And I watched the bubble back up from the float chamber back all the way up to the tank itself. There was no leaks. So I thought, normally I was thinking it would have been leaking out of the overflow, which means fuel would be coming out underneath the bike, because typically the overflow drains down past the swing arm. And I do recall, I might have mentioned in a previous video, the carburetor body was all full of fuel. That whole area around the carburetor there was all full of fuel and contamination of fuel and oil. So, oil meaning from being dirty and residue on the outside of the carburetor. There's no oil in the fuel. And I thought, that's most curious, because if the float needle valve was sticking open and it was overflowing out the overflow tube, it would again come out of the bottom underneath the bike. This didn't leak at all. So then what I did is I went back to the fuel line, the original fuel line. This is it right here. This is the fuel line I pulled off the bike, and you can see right here that dry rot. See that crack right there? That's literally the way it came off the bike. I did not induce that. I noticed it when it was actually on the bike, when I was starting to take it off. I don't like these big old fuel filters either on motorcycles, but nonetheless, I believe what was happening is it was leaking here, and all the fuel is running down the side of the carburetor and on the engine cases there, which is what I had found and cleaned off. It's all been cleaned since then, of course. And there wasn't getting adequate fuel into the carburetor to charge the float ball so that the bike would run. And on top of that, when he used the starting fluid, I don't believe he ever pulled this filter element out. And I think what he was doing was just giving a shot into the intake of the carburetor, and the starting fluid or ether was not getting past this, enough of it anyway. It wasn't getting past this foam and into the engine to allow the engine to start. And that's why it would only maybe pop for him once or twice. So the long story short, I got the bike running, and it runs fine. Now I'm not going to run it today. It's snowy and it's cold and windy outside, so I'm not going to take it outside. I'm not certainly going to run it in the shop today. It's nice and warm in here. I'm going to leave the doors closed. Eventually, as we wrap up this short series, I will show the bike running, but you'll have to take my word for it right now. It does run, and it runs fine. I let it set about a week or so, 4 or 5 days, maybe a week. Recently, came back to start it without starting fluid, and it started in 4 or 5 kicks and ran and idled fine. So I believe, you know, frankly, there's nothing wrong with it. I just think it wasn't getting fuel and starting fluid enough to get it to start. I think it's fine. And I'll validate that later on when I get a chance to take it on a nice day, when the snow's gone and the mud's gone, and I can ride it a little bit and make sure it's running okay. But I think it's fine. The 2 other problems, the horn didn't work and the rear brake light didn't work. Let me reposition a little bit here the camera to talk about the horn situation, and both of those items have been corrected and are now working, and let me explain to you what I found. There's the horn button right here. I can demonstrate this for you. Let me turn on the key. Pretty anemic, but it does work. All of them are anemic back in the day. But what I discovered after studying this, and I used my continuity or multimeter, and I first tested the horn with a good battery, made sure the horn worked. At the horn itself, it did. So I knew it wasn't the horn, and I started backtracking in the wiring, all the connections, and I worked my way all the way back, and everything. I had continuity throughout the entire system until I got to the control clamshell itself. So I opened this up and did some testing, and there was continuity to the wiring up to the horn. Now the way this system works, and I'm not going to go into a lot of electrical theory here, but the gist of it is when you push this button, it simply pulls the circuit for the horn to ground and completes the circuit back to the battery and allows the horn to beep. So when you do this, and push that button with your thumb, it simply grounds out the circuit and completes it back to the battery, and the horn then will beep. That's the theory. And what I discovered, and I really just kind of stood here and looked at the setup we've got here, and I thought, these handlebars, I wonder, because they're painted, if they're aftermarket. So I went online and did some brief research, and what I found is most of the XT250s of this era I saw in photos, or at least many of them, had chrome handlebars. Now I did see a few from time to time that had black similar to this. My supposition is, or my conclusion is, these are aftermarket handlebars. The originals were chrome. And of course you can get a contact and a ground through chrome, because it depends on this clamshell getting a ground to the frame and system to allowing this horn to work. So what I did is, after opening this all up, of course, so I could get exposure to the bottom side, and this grounds this button on the bottom of the handlebar, I just took a Dremel with a little wire wheel and wire wheeled off the paint on the bottom half of the third probably of the handlebar, cleaned it up really good, put it back together, and voila, the horn works fine. By the way, I did test it before I did that by grounding out the switch and running ground to the engine to test it, and it worked, so I knew that it was a ground problem here. I skipped that explanation a moment ago, but after removing the paint from the bottom of the handlebar, the horn works. Put it back together, and we're in business. So that's been solved. That horn probably hasn't worked, I'm very sure of it, since these aftermarket handlebars were installed. I don't know how it could. Let's move on to the brake light. So I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate the brake light. I'm going to squeeze the right handlebar grip of the brake, and you'll see the brake light works. And now I'm going to push the foot pedal, and you can see the brake light works off of both switches. What I discovered is that, again, I started here at the taillight and checked for a good bulb, of course, first. The previous owner said he checked for that as well, and the bulb was good. So the bulb was brand new, in fact. So I knew we had a good bulb. I started checking wiring all the way back and checked all the connections, and everything was good. Right? All the way up to we get into this part of the bike here. I thought, well, let's start with one switch at a time. So the first thing I did was unplug the handlebar brake, hand grip brake, and it worked off the rear brake light. In other words, when I would push the brake pedal, it would work, the brake light would work. When I plugged in the front brake right here on the handlebar, the light wouldn't work. It wouldn't work off of either switch. So that started my thinking to isolate it to the front brake light switch. And I continued to do the testing of the wiring with my multimeter, and everything seemed good up to, I went into the headlight shell, and everything seemed good all the way up into the headlight shell, which is where the front brake switch goes into the headlight shell and ties into the master loom. So let's relocate up here at the front brake light connection where the wiring plugs in, and we'll talk about that a little bit further. Obviously, we have a close-up view here of the right handlebar grip assembly throttle cables, and this is the front brake switch right here, or lever rather. This is the wiring. This is actually the switch itself that's activated by the handle grip that you see right here. And this snakes down into the headlight shell and ties into the wiring loom. This is the switch itself. And what I discovered after studying it, since I confirmed the wiring was okay up, at least in the headlight shell, I was, again, just observing and studying it. This connection right here was where this just plugs in and locks and twists, was backed out and wasn't plugged in and locked in all the way. So I fiddled with this a little bit, and this is a fairly common arrangement. I think Honda uses the same arrangement style switch on some of their bikes. I took it apart, looked at it, the contacts looked clean, put it back together, locked it back into position the way I believe it should work. And again, it worked. The brake light works from the front brake grip right here, handle, as well as the foot brake that I just demonstrated. So I'm not exactly sure what happened here, but for some reason this not being engaged all the way did not complete the circuit for either switch and didn't allow the brake light to work. When this was taken out of the circuit, the rear brake light switch would work. When I relocated this, which I believe is correctly as it is now, the brake light started to work again. So again, whether this was out of service since they changed these handlebars, I don't know, possibly. But nonetheless, it's fixed. So everything he has asked me to do, that is horn, rear brake light, and getting it running, has really been accomplished. I did check the valve adjustment, and the exhaust valve was a little sloppy, the intake valve was a little tight, but neither one of those settings would have prevented the bike from running. I did that, by the way, after I got the bike running, so the bike did start before I adjusted the valve. So the valves have been adjusted. I have also, let me back up the camera. I have also adjusted the decompression release. That's that cable you see right there that goes down to the kickstart lever, and when you push on the lever, it activates a little linkage that opens the exhaust valve to make it easier to kickstart the engine. I did adjust that because that was tight. I was concerned that might be holding that exhaust valve in an incorrect position, so I adjusted that. I do have to adjust the cam chain, yet I have not done that. I need to run the bike for a few minutes to do that, so that's coming up. And then I think it's just a matter of putting it all back together and waiting till the weather's nice enough that I can take it for a test run up and down my driveway, up and down the road a little bit. It's very muddy out, snowy and wet right now, so I'm going to wait. It'll be probably a few weeks. Once that's done, we'll go back to the owner. Now I will do a follow-up video with the bike outside and it running so you can actually see that it does work. It'll be probably a few weeks out yet before we get to that. That's going to be it for this little update, folks. Any issues, questions, thoughts, drop me a note. Otherwise, as usual, thanks for watching.